My name is Jen Miller. I'm the director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio, and it's my honor to kick this off today. I think many of you know that the League is fiercely nonpartisan and member-led. And these kinds of programs really matter to us because we want to make sure our voters are informed. One of our concerns is that sometimes voters skip the judicial races, and we want to make sure that voters understand what judges do and why they matter, and how having an independent and strong judiciary is good for all of us. And with that, I am honored to introduce my friend and a brilliant leader for the League of Women Voters as a volunteer. Her name is Annette Tucker Sutherland. She is an attorney. She's a member of the Greater Cleveland League of Women Voters. She's incredibly active in the Citizens Not Politicians campaign, is a former member of the Shaker Heights School Board, and just an overall lovely human being. And with that, I turn it over to you, Annette.
Good evening. Thanks, Jen. Good evening and welcome to our virtual audience, zooming in from all over Ohio to learn about judicial elections issues. Some background. By law, the minimum requirements to serve as judge are these: a licensed attorney with at least 6 years of experience who must be under 70 years old before the election. Each term is 6 years. All Ohio judges, from our Supreme Court to our municipal courts, must seek election. However, studies show that many voters fail to mark their ballots for candidates for judicial positions. We've already prepared some questions for discussion with the panelists, and then we will open to questions from our audience. Please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. Let's meet our panelists tonight. Rachel Dissell is a journalist who has been covering the justice system for more than 20 years. She currently serves as community and special projects editor for Signal Cleveland and a contributing editor for the Marshall Project in Cleveland. The two newsrooms collaborated to launch a guide to help voters learn about judges and candidates for the bench. She's a two-time winner of the DART Award for Excellence in Coverage of Trauma. Panelist Jonathan Entin is Professor Emeritus of Law at Case Western Reserve University, where he taught constitutional law as well as other subjects, received teaching awards, and served as academic dean and advisor to the Law Review. He has authored more than 150 scholarly articles and publications. After graduating from Brown University, then Northwestern University Law School, he clerked for Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. Our third panelist, Jeremy Paris, is a graduate of Yale University and Harvard Law School. He currently earns his living at the Braben Group, a public affairs and organizational consulting group. He spent a decade on staff at the Senate Judiciary Committee, working on nominations to all federal courts, and served as chief counsel for nominations. His work included preparing committee members for the Senate hearings on the nominations of Justices Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. So we'll open with Jonathan. Why does it matter who's elected to the bench?
The people on the bench are the folks who make the decisions about what the law in Ohio is. And particularly for the Ohio Supreme Court, we're talking about the authoritative interpreters of Ohio law. The Ohio Supreme Court handles a large number of important issues. We know from the redistricting cycle that the court passes on the legality of legislative districts, but it hears a whole raft of other important matters, cases involving utility rates, property tax valuation, tort claims. Consider the boneless chicken wing case that was decided earlier this year, those sorts of things. And with the new reproductive rights amendment that was passed last year, we can expect the Ohio Supreme Court will be passing on the validity of a variety of abortion regulations that are currently under challenge in the lower courts or may soon be under challenge.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to some of those issues, but I wanted to turn to Rachel and ask, why do voters so often fail to actually vote on judicial candidates?
Well, let me flip that around a little bit. I hate to say that voters are failing in any way. I think we're failing voters from the folks that I've talked to. We know the Marshall Project kind of looked into some of the numbers on this and found that in Cuyahoga County, about a third of voters skipped judicial races altogether in 2020, even ones that were contested. And that when you really boil it down to the city, people who live in the city of Cleveland, even fewer, about a quarter of votes in all of those judge races came from residents. And when you talk to a lot of residents about this, as we did, as we were kind of wading into this, people told us that they had little to go on to understand maybe whether a candidate or whether a judge was a good fit for what they wanted to see on the bench. They told us that outside of occasional news coverage, which generally, was about one single case, they couldn't find a lot other than maybe what law school someone attended. And so they really didn't feel equipped to make a good decision. They were confused by names. And what folks really wanted was concrete answers to questions that they had. And I can share later what some of those questions were, but also a way to measure. Folks noted that there's so many judges that have been on the bench for a long time, and they have no way to measure whether they're doing what they would consider to be a good job or whether they're not really aligned with something that would get their vote. So instead of making the wrong choice in their minds, a lot of people just kind of opt out. And, what we did hear from people in general is they want more information about fairness, about sentencing habits, things that have actual information and data about them that could be collected and shared, but has not been made available to people to look at so they can consider it in election time.
Rachel, do you have any idea why we're seeing so many uncontested judicial races?
Yeah, I think it's some of the reasons that we talked about. It's not uncommon. I want to say it's not just here, across the country, judicial and also other legal system races. So for prosecutor or in places where they elect a sheriff, up to 85% of those races can be unopposed, And so I think running against an incumbent is hard because name recognition means a lot, but particularly when it comes to judges, if I'm going to decide to kind of throw my hat in the ring and run against a judge, and I have no way to talk about what their record is of what they've done, how they set bail, how they sentence, how often they divert people, because that information is just kind of held back, then I can't really make a good argument for myself and why I'd be a better candidate. So then it becomes kind of more of a personality or name-based contest, which I don't think people really appreciate. And so if you look at the ballot this year, we have 10 common pleas races, or 10 common pleas and juvenile judge candidates running unopposed, all of the 8th District Court Appeals judges running unopposed. Some folks are kind of just what I would call, I guess I shouldn't talk about baseball today, but a walk-on, right? They just put in for the ballot and now they're going to be a judge. And not that some of those candidates may not be good judges, it's just that people don't have a way to really assess that based on the information that is available.
So, Jeremy, the federal system is very different where judges are appointed. What experience do you think is important to gaining that appointment?
Thanks for having me. First of all, I just wanted to thank the League of Women Voters for doing this, and also just for your leadership as this incredible sort of advocates for democracy and for our community all the time. So Annette, thank you. Jen Miller, thank you. And it's no surprise you're thinking about this and trying to take a leadership role. So the federal system, judges are appointed. They're nominated by the president and confirmed by the U.S. Senate, and so it isn't an election. But I think some of the same themes apply, and I have a few thoughts about our judicial election system here. I start with what makes a good judge? That's still a question. We say qualified. So, there are different ways people judge when you're voting on a judges. There's judge for yourself. The Buckeye Justice Forum is running some wonderful programs to think about. And Signal, by the way, has done just such a public service to sort of unpack this. What does it mean to be qualified? There's a certain number of years, there's a certain number, you were a good lawyer, you were these things, you're well thought of by the community. In the federal system, there's this sort of ideological element to it. I mean, the decision of qualifications is very different. I actually think qualifications can sometimes be a sort of a biased term that's coded for you were a prosecutor for a number of years. But what about if you were a public defender? It's really important to have balance on a bench because I think about the end product of justice, the community and the people that are served by judges. The courts are really lawyers' business. Lawyers work in them. They're the people's business. So, do you have enough public interest lawyers and not just law firm partners? People bring their life experience. What about demographic diversity? Do judges represent the community they're in? This is something that, for example, in the Biden administration, there's been a real sea change in terms of like both the diversity and a background way of judges and justices on the Supreme Court. Justice Jackson, who was just in Cleveland, is the first public defender on the Supreme Court, she's also the first Black woman. And that's been true throughout the judiciary. You sort of have to say, well, are we using qualification as a bias for something else? I represent a point of view. So I think taking all that apart, I really think about that in terms of the kind of questions we ask and how we look at and what we look at when we think about judges. The other oddity in the system, and we don't have this in the federal system, where I actually worked on 8 different Supreme Court nominations in the federal system and hundreds of lower court judges. I could tell you almost to a person and not to a person, but almost to a person, they're all smart lawyers. Right? They're all really, really unbelievably credentialed people. You can look at credentials and you look at those things. There's this funny thing, though, when you elect judges and justices, which is you're layering 2 things on. This person's a good lawyer. Would they make a good judge? That's one thing. Then they've also got to be a political candidate, right? What an odd thing. So you have to learn how to run for office to go do this other job you often haven't done before, which is to be a judge if you haven't been a judge. That's 2 layers of weird before you get to this job. And then you got to decide, are they good at the job? And by the way, they're also hamstrung. They're political candidates, but they can't really be. They can't be out there on issues. And I'll say one last thing and then stop filibustering. I'm a former Senate staffer, so I'm used to filibustering. One thing that always strikes me as odd is this notion of you can't know a judge's opinion on something because they're going to have the case before them. But of course, one thing is, of course, we know, for example, on abortion, we know what Clarence Thomas, who's issued opinion after opinion on abortion, is going to do on the next abortion case. It doesn't mean he can't serve on that case. But we also have this weird idea of like pretending it's not a thing we know, or we're going to speak in code and decide. I just think and I really, Rachel, thank you for talking about the information. The more information we have, the better. And this is really the last thing. And I think this is something I would ask Jonathan and Rachel to think about or talk about, because you know infinitely more than like, what information do you want to know? What actually helps people unpack? When you walk into, I agree, I get the, like I'm a Democrat. I get the endorsement forms from the Democrats and I vote that slate. And by the way, everyone should vote on judges, and everyone should, by the way, go to the end of the ballot and vote on issue 1, right? It's just like at the end of the ballot, you got to vote on all the whole ticket, when you go vote, the whole ballot, however you're going to vote. But that's often my filter. Okay, they're endorsed.
All right. Thank you, Jeremy.
That's a silly filter. You guys should
sorry.
do better. That's a silly filter I use. I'm saying I'm like super knowledgeable and I use the dumbest filter. So I'm saying you guys should all do better.
Well, Rachel, I want to congratulate Signal and the Marshall Project for some pretty detailed information about judicial candidates that just was published. And why don't you talk more about that?
Yeah, so we published our general election version of the Judge's Guide this week. And first off, I want to say this is really just kind of the beginning. It's the first year this has been available as a tool for people. And we know that it needs to have actually a lot more information than it has. It was kind of a starting point, an experiment, because the guide that you see up now, a lot of the information that's in this guide was actually gathered by community members. So Signal Cleveland works with Cleveland documenters that we train and pay to go to public meetings and take notes and do interviews. Many of them helped with this research, which I think is great, because then we have other people in the community that know how to do this research. They were often very frustrated about how little information there was out there for people running for judge. In fact, when we were doing research for the primary, they even found someone that wasn't registered to vote. And they're like, how are they running for judge, right? But the other thing that we've done is we've reached out to community members and tried to figure out what they want to know. So we know that they want the data. We know the data is really hard to get, and we're working on that. But we thought, what if we bring to candidates questions from people. And I would never say like anything about any other guides. Like I want more information, never less. So Judge for Yourself has good measurement from attorneys who work in the courts. What we wanted to do is bring community voices. So for instance, if you look at the Ohio Supreme Court profiles, like one of the questions that we asked candidates was share an example of a case you handled as a judge or a prosecutor or a defense attorney that has or would influence your approach to being an Ohio Supreme Court justice and why. People want to know more about the why and the how people make decisions. Folks wanted to know how people handle their own personal bias. They wanted to know whether they actually personally knew anyone who had ever gone through the justice system. And only one person that answered said yes and explained that. And so I think that was really helpful when people maybe feel like they can't say, here's how I feel about this type of case. By them giving an example of a case that was meaningful to them or influenced how they made decisions, those answers were actually the most detailed and things that I didn't see anywhere else. I think in the county system, people wanted to know how folks felt about bail reform and other things like that. So there are opportunities for these candidates to say how they feel about the status quo right now. But one of the things that kind of interested me is that every time we ask regular folks this, they want to know what are things that candidates do when they're not on the bench or when they're not doing their day job? What do they do in the community? And I think that's kind of a proxy for getting a sense of like, who are you? What matters to you? So I love it when we can take those questions right to candidates. I'll love it even more when we have solid data to share on sentencing and bail choices for sitting judges that people can consider.
I noted some of the candidate insights that appeared in the boxes for each candidate. Maybe you could talk about why you chose some of those.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on what we had. We really tried to include things that people told us directly if we had them. I do think that not all the candidates answered the questions this time around, and I think in part that gets to a question that we're going to talk about later, but I think it was new and they didn't know who we were and what we were doing. So I'm actually in the process right now of sending the current iteration of the guide back to any candidates who didn't answer so they can see how it looks and see how they're represented. And then hopefully they'll be willing to answer some of the questions and we can add them. Because I think there's a little bit of trepidation from candidates now in terms, like we had a number of questions from like Ohio Supreme Court candidates were saying like, are you going to edit these answers? How are they going to be presented? Because I think there's a big concern about that from candidates that are running. So it's also about folks putting this together, building trust with candidates. And so I know that was a lot of information, but I think that Jeremy also said he would love to hear from Jonathan on this. And I kind of would too, because I think that, the things to look for in a candidate are pretty important. And I don't actually know all of them.
Jonathan?
I'm not entirely confident that I have a good answer to this either. A lot of judicial candidates hesitate to say too much, partly because there are ethics rules that limit what judicial candidates can say. They're not supposed to commit themselves to how they're going to rule on a particular case, for example, or even how they would rule on a particular issue, right? But we might be able to ask judicial candidates, particularly when we're talking about, say, the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court, how do they go about interpreting the law? What matters to them? How much does real world experience affect the way they might decide a case? And how much are they guided by a kind of overarching philosophy? Because we see those sorts of things playing out in cases all the time. That's harder to get at when you're looking at, say, common pleas judges who are handling trials, because most of the time they're handling important issues, but they're kind of one-off sorts of things. And so the kinds of aspects of a judge's approach that you want to know about at the trial level have much more to do with kind of how much are they willing to exert a certain degree of control over the parties to keep things moving along without somehow stifling the ability of the parties to make their arguments. Uh, you know, another problem, especially at the trial level, that I think may affect Rachel's ability to find out some of the information about how trial judges do things is that information might be available if, say, the court administrators would pull it together. But a lot of judges, especially when they have to run for reelection, might not want to have too granular details about this because they might be afraid that if they did something unusual or they had a high profile case, they don't want to have that cherry picked and have them made out to be soft on crime or something like that. I mean, there was a reference to Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson earlier, and one thing that you saw in her confirmation hearing was that she was questioned repeatedly by senators who were trying to make her out as somehow soft on child molesters, when what she was doing was actually quite consistent with what the normal range of federal trial judges were doing in similar kinds of cases. And so that's another piece of the story that people worry about. Just as Jeremy has the experience about the contentious confirmation process for federal judges, but you have similar kinds of concerns. I'm not saying that these are justifications for not having information, but I think in terms of why it's hard to get the information, people running for judgeships are understandably a little bit nervous that they're going to get cherry picked and made to look like they're just incompetent or worse.
I think this goes to the controversy over federal sentencing guidelines and giving judges a preset range of penalties for certain crimes where judges find that the facts of each case may be so different that they want to have more flexibility. And then they worry that when you gather the data, you're going to lose sight of the fact that situations can be very different involving the same crime. Did you hear any of that, Rachel, when you were investigating?
I mean, there's a couple of thoughts that I have. I mean, I've definitely hear from candidates who are worried, especially if they're already a judge, about a single case that they have decided being compared with another case, as we've seen happen in the media, right? In the news. I actually think that providing more data consistently is kind of the antidote to that. If you have data over time that you can look at, you can kind of see where people fall in ranges. So just an example of that, if I'm going to compare two people who were sentenced, which happened kind of recently in two different courtrooms for similar crimes, the judges will say something like every case is individual. And I do believe that there are individual sets of facts in every case. But also anyone who works with data and research and stuff knows that you can look at a broad set of data to get indications of how someone acts. When the Marshall Project looked at bail, we were able to look at thousands and thousands of cases that were similar situated cases that had people that had similar levels of criminal record in the past and see how judges decided on bail. And you could see that there was great variation. And so I do think that there's, like we talked about, some trepidation from judges who sit on the bench because they don't want to be shown as, at the top of that. They always, set a high bail, or at the bottom of that, they almost never set a high bail. But in reality, they should want that data on their own actions, and they should want to understand it and know why they're making the decisions they make. And they should want people to know, are they kind of in the middle ground of the pack of judges, or are they way over here, way over there? And whatever someone thinks of that is up to them. Do they want a judge that is tougher on bail? Do they want a judge that is, less tough on bail? that's for the voters to decide, and they could have room to discuss how they make those decisions instead of having to defend a single case.
Yeah.
If they trust, but what I sense is a lack of trust that people can understand their jobs and how they do it and how they make decisions. And I think that's what was unfortunate. The answer should be, let's share more information and data and let's educate citizenry and voters more, not, we can't trust you with this information, just vote for us.
You guys have made such wonderful points, and I keep coming around to, I don't know that voters know, I don't know that I know, like, what is the job of a judge? What do you want them to do? Like, what's, I mean, we all have watched TV, some of you may have lawyers have practiced in courts and, dramatic courtroom scenes, but, ultimately, a lot of the role of a judge is actually, I got to think about this family in front of me. And if I bind over the weekend and this woman, the mom is not getting home to the kids, and and the impact on the broader system, and I need to be solicitous here or not, and I have a court administration problem because I have a case log and I'm being judged for how long these cases are taking, and I'm in a system that is bad and under-resourced, and I'm doing my best. And all that goes on. And then you're laying on the thing Jonathan's talking about, which is, wow, I have to run for office and I don't want to be judged on the extreme ends. And I think of that in the federal system. Often lower court judges are auditioning for elevation to a higher court by a president of their party. And how does that change their decisions or not, right? Which is a really insidious thing. And by the way, Jonathan, you're totally right about Justice Jackson, and it shocked people, twisted words. Justice Sotomayor came to the bench, and I worked on that nomination. She was the single most experienced federal judge ever to be nominated to the Supreme Court in terms of the number of years of federal judicial service. And all the other party was talking about was the speech she gave, talking about how a wise Latina would think differently about these decisions, which of course was just about how do we bring life experience to the bench. So I think when your information flow, and I have to say, Rachel, it's been a godsend having this new information. I think the layer on top of it is a public discussion about what do we want judges to do? What role do we want them to play in the system? And that's a harder thing to sort of filter and decide. So it's a hard job we're talking about, but I think the bias towards more information makes a lot of sense.
I want to pick up on something you said, Jeremy, and turn to Jonathan for this one. What is the effect of, you talked about auditioning for appointment by the president of your party to a higher bench. What is the impact in Ohio of listing party affiliation on judges on the ballot?
Well, let's talk about this in both an intellectual sense and a political sense. We've just spent probably 15 or 20 minutes talking about what it is that judges do and how do we assess how good they are or are likely to be at the job. And we've had this discussion at a really abstract, general level. It's really hard to have that discussion, even for smart folks who, at least in theory, know more than the average person about how judges do their jobs and how the court system works. So if we have trouble articulating these things, imagine how challenging it is for individual voters. It's very hard to put for people to get a real sense about this. And so the idea of putting party labels on judicial candidates, and notice, by the way, that we do this only for the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals, not for trial judges. That's unusual. States that use partisan elections generally run them across the board. Put that to one side. But the idea is that the party label might be a kind of proxy for other things that matter to voters. And we talked earlier about the drop-off, the significant percentage of voters who don't vote in judicial elections, even though they cast ballots for other offices. Well, one thing that we discovered when we last time around in 2022, when we put the party labels on the Supreme Court ballot was that the drop-off for Supreme Court voting was a lot less than it used to be. Now, there is good reason to think that putting party labels on judicial candidates was not a kind of good government reform. But I think putting party labels on the ballot, whether this was done for a good reason or a not so good reason, may be a way for some voters to decide, well, I don't know much else about this candidate, but I know that this candidate is running on my party's ticket, and that maybe tells me something that I might not otherwise know. But how we evaluate that is partly a function of how do we think about the process of selecting judges, and to what extent do we think that we want to have party labels have a significant impact on how people vote. For over 100 years, we didn't put party labels on judicial candidates for any office. And we didn't do that because Ohioans thought for a long time that judges were not really like other kinds of elected officials, even though we elect them. And we don't want to have people bringing what might not necessarily be the most important kind of consideration to how we decide which judicial candidate to support.
Jeremy, I want to come back to you on the question of how do you see judicial candidates navigating their judicial independence with their party affiliation?
That is a really tough question, Annette. And, as well as they can, not that well. It's sort of, there's something, I'm really reacting also to weaving the two things, what Jonathan just said about how, party label, all of a sudden the drop-off drops off on voting because it's a proxy for something we understand, right? Parties are standing for, they share my policy views or my values in some, at least in broad ways, if not in particular ones. And so it digests a complex thing to a simple thing. So in some sense, it is a good guidepost to people. It disadvantages Democrats in the state to have the D label and not the R label versus more independence. There is a tension between any of our selection processes, whether it's the federal system I've worked in with nomination and confirmation, or the voting system, between independence and the job of judge, and then like this sort of semi-politician, junior league politician hat, where I have to go run for office and advocate for certain things. And on the other hand, judges are really powerful and consequential in people's lives. I mean, if the reason we have issue 1 on the ballot right now is that, the court was ignored in its rulings, and the Republican Supreme Court, Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor issued rulings saying striking down the districts, and they were ignored. And so you had this funny moment where it was a shock because this is a very powerful thing. We're used to the Supreme Court getting the final say. So having those proxies is useful. I think we will have to come together and think about, and by the way, I will say, on most cases, and certainly at the lower courts, not on the Supreme Court, I think judges are trying really hard to do a good job. I think they're trying really hard to sort of be fair in the case in front of them and think about the litigants. I don't think a judge is thinking, I'm just going to do a bad job here, or I'm trying to advertise. I think it probably comes in on the edges and on controversial cases. I think that I want to know more. I want judges to speak more about how they're going to approach the law, about what considerations they think are important about their job. Frankly, it's not about a particular case, but I'll give the example I used before. Do they think it's important to take into account what poverty does to a litigant and to their situation and to their child care and their kids? That's something that's important to me. I want to know more about that. And so if having to make them talk about that in the course of running constrains their independence because it means I'm more likely to vote for them and maybe organize politics around getting judges that do that, then I want it to constrain their independence, or I want people to run that are going to do that. I think sometimes that question is a coded question about independence. If they're doing things I don't like, right? And I will own that bias. Last thing I'll say on this, in the federal system, and I think it's also true in this, people generally are deeply uncomfortable with the idea that judges have so much power. And so it's easier to think of them as non-political, right? They're just judges doing a thing, and it's law and it's not politics, because otherwise they're a non-democratic, unchecked sort of power structure. Certainly the federal system, they're unchecked power structure. I think if we accept that they're political positions, and certainly when you vote on them, they're political, and judge them accordingly, right? And then we just need to unpack what we really want judges to be. I know I keep circling back to that. And I think that's something that I'll pitch to you, Annette, in terms of like the public outreach and what the League of Women Voters does in this public. It's like, what are you saying to the public about how we're judging the role? Like, how do we describe the role? And to you, Rachel, in terms of how you're laying that out, to you, Jonathan, when you're teaching students and young lawyers to think about this, what are you urging them to think about? Is there, they probably have no, I'm a recovering lawyer. I still have no idea.
Well, Jeremy, let me pick up on that. I mean, one kind of question that we might want to ask judicial candidates is, how do you think about the consequences of your rulings when you make them? That actually is a question that can help get judges and judicial candidates to talk about their philosophy, because especially when we're talking about appellate court judges and Supreme Court justices, they're ruling not just in the case at hand, but they're ruling in ways that could have broader implications. And getting a sense about how much they think that those other implications matter can actually tell us a surprising amount about how judges come at things. Because if you ask any judge, any judge will tell you, I take every case as it comes, right? No judge is going to say, no, I'm out here to further my partisan or philosophical agenda, even though sometimes people might suspect that maybe some judges do that, right? So that's why I think if we can get that sort of more general question, we might actually learn something from judges. Well, and that could help us figure out what to make of each of these folks.
I think that is a great project for the League and for Signal. Maybe we can think of ways to make that happen. Rachel, I was wondering if you have any data on how people in Ohio or America view the supposed impartiality of judges.
I don't know if I specifically have data on that. I think there is data out there. What I can say is that when we were asking people what they wanted to know about judges, often, or candidates, often their questions were about bias and fairness. So it's something they're very curious about. I know that there's studies out there, maybe some Pew research that shows maybe 70% of Americans think Supreme Court justices are more guided by ideology than fairness or impartiality. I feel like when you get down to the trial court level, it's probably less that someone feels like they can see that, and more like they're questioning, like what guides you and what makes your decisions. We have a lot of folks that want to know about discretion. They feel like judges have a lot of discretion and they want to know how they'll use it. And on the flip side, if you talk to judges and candidates, they'll say, that's a tough question, because if it's your family member in front of me, you would like me to use my discretion to be more lenient, probably, right? And if you're on the other side of the case, you probably want me to use my discretion to be less lenient. And I don't know that it's that binary, but that's what people want to know. And so we have worked questions into the guide. And in fact, I think, and I have to look, but I guess I'll just say it instead because it doesn't matter. There was a candidate who answered one of the questions that basically said like, oh, I don't have any bias. And people were like screenshotting it being like, I can't vote for this person because they won't even have the idea that they might have some personal bias. And so that's a thing that people are really interested in getting some insight into. I mean, I think when candidates are saying like, I actually try to think about that, and maybe why do I feel or think this way? And is something else creeping in? People kind of like to see that. But I think it's getting at the same thing. Where are you coming from? Why are you making, why would you make the decisions you make? Who are your people? Things like that are kind of human things that people want to know about that.
Thank you. I want to remind our audience that we will address audience questions. Please use the Q&A function to submit any questions you may have. And meanwhile, we're going to turn from ideological motivation to money and talk about funding judicial races. Jonathan, I know you've done a little bit of research on this. Maybe you could talk about how they're funded by the candidate, political parties, political action committees.
Well, there are different kinds of funding of judicial candidates. Judicial candidates in Ohio are allowed to receive contributions. There are limits about how much an individual can give, and it varies depending on the level of the court. And political parties are allowed to make contributions to judicial candidates. But that's all relating to the contributions directly to the candidates or the candidates campaign committee, right? Now, beyond that, there are the so-called independent expenditures that individuals or interest groups can spend. And basically, the sky's the limit on that. As long as the so-called independent expenditures are in fact independent and are not coordinated with the candidate committee. And so we see, particularly in races for the Ohio Supreme Court, the amount of money that is being spent in these races has gone up dramatically over the years. But the great majority of that money is the so-called independent expenditures that are not subject to these sorts of restrictions. I mean, there are also limits on what the candidates themselves can do. So, for example, the candidates can't personally solicit money from people, but they can sign letters that go out over their name. There are other things that the candidates are restricted from doing, but again, in some ways, what is unregulated by the dark money groups, the interest groups that are spending presumably on their own without coordination, that has a lot to do with the amount of money that's out there, and to some extent, it has something to do with the tone of the election campaigns, because a lot of interest groups are kind of really over the top, and they think that that's the way to get their message across, and to the extent that their candidates maybe will win, that's fine. Sometimes the over-the-top advertising doesn't quite do the job, but nobody wants to look like they're disarming, right? So so there's every reason for the interest groups to be as aggressive as possible, and that makes it all the more difficult to have voters get the kinds of information that Rachel and Jeremy and I have been talking about that might actually help voters make an informed decision.
Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great summary. And what I hear from people is that they see these commercials, they see these ads that get mailed to their houses, and you can sense when something, you're like, where is this really coming from, or who made up this name? But I think, regular folks, even voters who want to be informed, they don't have time to sit and do a ton of research on the name of this PAC and then who are they connected to and trace all the different tentacles to it. I mean, thank goodness for, some of the nonprofit media or like ProPublica that could really dive into US Supreme Court financial disclosures and stuff. But that kind of work is really intense. I think there's also a lot of local groups and advocate groups. And of course, like, Ohio Fair Courts and other folks who have tried to provide information and try to provide support on how people can do that research. But it's hard. It's just, it's one of the things where it makes me really sad about the fact that, when I started reporting, I was in a newsroom with 400 people. And now I'm in a newsroom with like 20 people. And so there's just not the ability to stay on top of that and to go as deep. And when there is, it just takes longer and a lot of resources. So I would love to see more folks coming together to collaboratively do that research and share it. Because I think if all the groups that are interested kind of come together and make plans to do this, we can get more information out there. That way, when someone picks up that flyer that got mailed to their house, they have another flyer that got mailed to their house that said, here's all the people who gave money. The other problem I think too is that there's a little delay in being able to really appropriately trace that. It's not like in the very moment you can trace all of these dollars that are given. You're often waiting till, mid or after an election cycle to really be able to figure out where certain, PAC money spending came from. So it's definitely a challenge, but I don't think that voters love kind of being left in the dark of dark money. I think it just actually creates a higher level of suspicion for everyone about those things and less trust of messaging, for at least for some voters.
Jonathan, maybe you could talk about how the Secretary of State attempts to track judicial spending on campaigns.
The Ohio election laws require all campaign committees to file reports periodically. And once they're filed, the Secretary of State is supposed to make them available online within 5 business days. But just to give you a sense about this, the most recent filing deadline was the end of July. The next filing deadline is 12 days before the election. And I sat down tonight and counted back. That means, I think, October 25th, something like that. Well, 5 business days after that is the Friday before the election. And so even if the Secretary of State's office gets these reports posted really fast, and I think they do, there's just not that much time for people to look at those reports, even if they're interested. And there's certainly not that much time for somebody like Rachel to go through them and actually put out information that would be useful to voters, many of whom will have already cast their ballots, either by absentee or early voting. So in some ways, even though the system is designed to provide for some degree of sunshine, it might not be very useful information in the real world because of the overall dynamics of how the political process and the voting system work.
Well, Rachel, say you have a candidate who's running for re-election to the Ohio Supreme Court. I'm not naming names, I'm just trying to pick a high profile race and a possibility where you do have the ability to look back in time at who supported the candidate last time. Are there reports that you could find on dark money, for example?
I mean, I think you can examine the PAC spending for sure. I don't know that it's always easy. I mean, I think if you look at, I listened to the incredible podcast that traced a bunch of dark money, but it sounds to me like it took, I don't know, a year or two to put that together and really figure out how that money was gathered and how how they plan the spending and stuff like that. So I do think that, of course things are possible, but as Mr. Entin said, it's the timeline to do it so that voters actually have the information. I think the time to tell someone about how that all unfurled isn't once they've already cast their ballot.
Well, I do see newspaper stories about how much media time has been purchased.
Yeah, it's
and
true.
That seems to be pretty current.
Correct. Yeah. But I think that, sometimes you might know the name of an entity that makes a purchase, but really knowing and understanding who is behind an entity that's the part that gets a little bit trickier. You have a lot of names that are very, I think one of the ones that we were talking about is like, judicial fairness initiative. I mean, that sounds like a great thing, right? Well, you don't really know whether it's a great thing about people that really support fairness or whether it's not, in your opinion as a voter, until you can dig into who are these folks? What are their motivations for supporting someone? Do they have any financial ties to this candidate? Do they own or operate any businesses that could benefit from decisions they make? I think those are things that actually do take a little bit of time to fairly assess, right? You don't want to just jump to conclusions about that. You really need to do your homework before you would, in fact, maybe make an allegation that someone has an untoward reason for supporting a candidate. So I do think that, yeah, a 5-day turnaround for that isn't great. But in terms of the ad buys, I think those give you nuggets of information on who's supporting things. But again, they need follow-up and they need reporting out to be done to share information on. And I think there's more people actually working on the campaigns than there are that are able to report on the campaigns. That makes it a tough dynamic.
Yeah, I'm always curious about like what did the people providing the money think they're buying? Like, why are they doing it? And I think that's right. I mean, when the Americans for Americans PAC does spending, and even by the way, the content of the ad might not and likely won't reflect the issue that they're fighting on. They're just doing a campaign ad to try to take somebody on, but their real interest might be, and often, it's a logical thing why judges become big spending. You can do things in a policy way you cannot achieve elsewhere in the democratic process. In Ohio, we enshrined abortion rights into our Constitution last year. And rather than fight that fight, which is unpopular, what if you fight to put judges on or justices on that limit that right? That's probably cheaper political spending from people that are on the other side of the issue and know that taking it on head on is unpopular, right? So it becomes certainly at the Supreme Court level. I mean, lower courts, I think it's a little bit different, but at the Supreme Court level, yeah, if you're fighting on policies that are important to you, you cannot ignore the judges. If you're fighting about democracy, if you're fighting about districts, if you're fighting about voting rights and votes, whether voter purges of voter rolls. If you think it's wrong that hundreds of thousands of voters are being purged from voter rolls by the Secretary of State, a court that's going to uphold that versus a court that's going to strike that down are very different. And so I actually wonder, is there too little money or too much money? Too much money or too little money? Like, where is it? Like we need to be smart about this. If you had a system that took that money out of it totally, you had a different system, that'd be one thing. But there is money on one side and not the other. And I sort of want to know what do they think they're getting? What are they getting? And by the way, I will also say this is another way in which I think the narrative of campaigns really matters. Are the people responsible for this spelling out in narrative ways and compelling ways for the public what is at stake? Why you should care about who these judges are and these justices are. It is truly, for most people, an afterthought. Truly. And so that DR question, Jonathan, is like, it becomes a proxy for something that probably is truer with the Supreme Court than not. But I know I sound very cynical today. I actually think people react in really smart ways when they're communicated with in ways that have to do with consequences. And say, Jonathan, I really think about your question about like, are these judges thinking about the consequences of cases? A wonderful question. I wish when I was writing questions for senators on the Senate Judiciary Committee, you had suggested that to me, because I think that is a very much a question that is beyond what is this case? And like, what are the equities you're bringing into thinking about the case as a judge, which I really want to know about. So I'm just going to name that as a great thing I'm going to take back. I'm going to steal next time I'm writing a question.
Well, we have time for one more question, and this is one that Jonathan and I had talked a little bit about in preparation. A lot of people have wondered why the governor of Ohio has a son sitting on the Supreme Court of Ohio who gets to refuse to recuse himself from cases where the governor is a party. So could you comment on that, please, Jonathan?
Well, how we have that situation is more than I can get into, but I will tell you that the rules, the Code of Judicial Conduct in Ohio says that a judge should not sit in any case where an immediate family member, like a parent or a child, is a party. It's a bright line rule. And I don't see any plausible reading of that rule that would have allowed Justice DeWine to sit in the redistricting cases because the governor was a named defendant in that litigation. But the way the system works, each individual judge gets to decide whether to sit or not. Justice DeWine said he didn't think he had to recuse, and so he didn't. Now, I think this is a more problematic situation at the Ohio Supreme Court than it would be at the US Supreme Court, because at the US Supreme Court, if the justice doesn't sit, we have a short bench. We had the case today, the Oklahoma death penalty case, where Justice Gorsuch didn't sit because he was on the lower court at a time when that case was there. So there's the potential of a deadlocked court with him not sitting. At the Ohio Supreme Court, if the justice doesn't sit, there is a mechanism for replacing the justice with a Court of Appeals judge who sits by designation. So that seems to me to argue for a stricter following of the letter of the rule than we've seen. This is a really unusual situation. There are plenty of situations where people may want a justice to recuse for various reasons, and a lot of those situations are harder calls than this one.
At the risk of not being invited back, I will just say it's nuts. It's nuts. It's wrong. It's corruption. It cannot happen. This is what happens when they are policing themselves. And and we see this, by the way, at the Supreme Court, which there is no accountability mechanism, the US Supreme Court, for recusals, and we're seeing all these for these wild sort of ethical scandals and money coming in, and they're like, well, what are we gonna do? I'm not gonna recuse. And you're right, Jonathan, there's no reason for him to sit. And there's every reason for him not to sit, but the fact that we do not have accountability for this is bad.
Right. And I think this gets to the public cynicism about the judiciary. I mean, this is an easy call, right? I think any fair reading of the judicial code in Ohio gives you one and only one answer. There may be other situations where the call is harder, but this one's easy. And it's troublesome.
I'm going to call it for time now. I'm so sorry, but we are very short of time. And I can't close without talking a little bit about issue 1. Perhaps our audience is wondering, what is the role of judges in the Citizens Not Politicians proposed amendment? Well, right off the bat, of course, the Supreme Court would be rendering decisions on contests and challenges to maps drawn by the commission. And furthermore, the retired judges, 2 from each major political party, will be selected by the opposite political party to form a bipartisan panel. And that panel would administer the process of reviewing applications for citizens to sit on the 15-member Citizen Redistricting Commission. That's 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, 5 independents. And the amendment details a process for those applications, the screening, public screening, the interviews would be videotaped and broadcast, and selection of commissioners. And the bipartisan panel also identifies potential special masters or professionals who are experts in this field to assist the Ohio Supreme Court in evaluating any challenges to the commission's proposed maps. The sponsors of this program urge you strongly to vote yes for change and to ban gerrymandering through issue 1. As a final closing, I want to thank our highly informed and engaged panelists. Thank you to Ohio Fair Courts Alliance for collaborating with planning and promoting this webinar. Tonight's program has been recorded and will be posted on YouTube by tomorrow. If you would like to see more programs like this, please consider donating to the League of Women Voters. Thank you all, and good night.